So, guess who got a webcam? I know, I'm really surprised too. Anyway, I thought I would mix it up a little bit this week, and since I got a new webcam, talk about something that isn't comics. Because really, the thing that really grabbed me this week was a video game, and honestly, it's much better to talk about that than to talk about Watchmen again. Admittedly, this kind of goes in with Watchmen, because the thing is, it also deals with authoritarianism, because what we're going to be talking about is kind of the lukewarm authoritarianism of Watch Dogs 3. See, Watch Dogs has what you might want to call the Saints Row loop, where the first game is super gritty and serious, the second game kind of takes the things from the first game that work and makes it a little more stylized, and the third game just falls off a cliff, and the series just dies there. Now, when we're talking about Watch Dogs, the thing that goes through the series is the concept of big data or big tech. Everyone's spying on you, everyone knows what you're doing and knows your profiles. It's very almost cyberpunk-y. Now, I'm no fan of cyberpunk, not just 2099, but as a genre, I'm not really interested in cyberpunk, because it's really based around things that were relevant in the 1980s but aren't relevant now. Most of the themes and ideas are outdated, and so when you see a game like Watch Dogs 3 and it kind of plays all the same notes as something that you might have seen in like 1989, it really doesn't feel right. I should point out that Watch Dogs 3 on its own doesn't really do anything that's strange or new to the genre. Third-person action RPGs and open-world settings really like to have the player play as a rebel of some kind. It makes it very easy to explain why the player character is going around liberating areas, picking up things, etc., etc. Now, there's two ways that games really like to make this story of rebellion work, and the first is to have the player craft a character. This is something you see in Mass Effect or Saints Row, where the player starts off the game by creating their own character, and then that character, which is a stand-in for the player, goes through the game doing various actions. That creates a sort of investment by the player. The second is to have the player play as an established character. This is how Assassin's Creed usually works, where you take a character that fits the world and then you invest in that character as they go around and do things. Watch Dogs 3, however, is the first game I've ever seen that chooses to do neither of these things. In fact, it's the only game I think I've ever seen that chooses to not have a character at all. Now, that's really hard, because even games like Doom, where Doom Guy is a silent protagonist who just kills things and essentially is barely seen by the player, he still has a character. Even if he's not saying anything, even if we never see his face, because we're the player playing through him, and because he is the avatar of the character, we can infer his character through the actions that he takes. But Watch Dogs 3 instead goes a completely different route, where you're essentially taking on various NPCs, and you're supposed to, I guess, infer that because you're taking on the role of various characters that you can't really customize, that their struggle is your struggle. But this doesn't work. This doesn't make for compelling gameplay, and it really doesn't, because all of the characters are completely replaceable. Because you can't customize them, and because they're not individuals with their own characteristics, we as an audience don't really invest in their struggle for liberation. And speaking of liberation, one of the main things that you always do when you're writing a story about rebels versus empire, or rebels fighting against some authority, is you really need to make sure that the character that the audience is seeing the world through, that their struggle is also the struggle of the rebellion that they're fighting. Here's a good example. You know how in Star Wars A New Hope, the main titular character is Luke Skywalker? we see the world through his eyes, essentially, because we're following him through his hero's journey. But one thing that they make sure to do is that he, our character that we're following, that his success or failure is also the rebellion's success or failure. We don't care about the rebellion because of what they're doing individually. We care about the rebellion because he cares about the rebellion, because the rebellion is him. Because he's choosing to engage with the rebellion, because he's choosing to embody their ideals, he, and thus the rebellion, are the people we get behind. Without Luke Skywalker in Star Wars, the rebellion doesn't matter. We as the audience don't invest in them. And so Watch Dogs 3 has this problem where, because none of the characters are really characters, they're just NPCs essentially, we don't have like a place where we can triangulate how we feel about anything that's going on. So it really doesn't matter when we see our enemies doing terrible things because we have no investment in what's going on. Another bigger problem with this is that because we don't really have a stake, because there's really no personalization to what's going on, it relies on very generic sort of terms and ways of talking. Every single NPC that you talk to recruit goes something like this. You look like someone who wants to make a difference. You're right, I am someone who wants to make a difference. You should join DedSec so we can overthrow the yoke of our oppressors. You're totally right, I am definitely going to join your terrorist group and overthrow the yoke of our oppressors. That's every conversation that the NPCs have with each other in this game. It's insane. And it's a real problem because you can't really tell what they're recruiting for, because there's no real like underlying idea of what they really want. They just talk about freedom in the most generic terms. And part of the problem is that the game doesn't really have, for lack of a better term, the balls to kind of go through with saying anything that's distinct. We live in an age right now where authoritarianism is everywhere and easy to see. Like right now, there's government crackdowns going on across the world, in Eastern Europe, in Asia, where governments are using their militaries to essentially stifle protest and free speech. And so it kind of feels like it wants to wear the skin or the outfit of a freedom fighter or a rebel, but it doesn't know what it's talking about. It feels like that kid in high school who was always talking about communism and, you know, seizing the means of production, but he doesn't actually know what he's talking about because he's never actually read anything or had any experiences that would inform his worldview. Like, the game wants to talk about authoritarianism in Britain, something which is currently relevant in the world. Like, right now, with the whole Brexit thing and, you know, the Tory Parliament, authoritarianism in Britain is a serious concern. But the game is so worried about offending people and so worried about having something to say that it does things like change the flag of Britain so it's completely different colors. So even when you set the game in London and the idea is that it's a future, you know, city of London that doesn't really look like London, it doesn't really sound like London, and the flag is different, and so nothing really feels like London. In fact, you could pretty much set this game anywhere, in any city, aside from the monuments and the landmarks that are scattered around. There's nothing really that sets this place apart from any other major city. In fact, when I was running around inside of it, I was like, this feels like we're running around Detroit. It feels like Baltimore. It feels like any other burned out inner city. And speaking of, one of the weirdest things is that for a game that talks about authoritarianism, it doesn't actually implement any of the ideas that it talks about. Oh, it talks a whole lot about how the citizens are always being monitored and all the cars have GPSs in them and everything is tracked all the time. But you know what also is true in this game? There's graffiti everywhere. There's graffiti on every surface, which shouldn't be possible because there's drones everywhere filming everyone's every move. So you shouldn't be able to do this because they should be picking you up immediately when you commit crimes. The real problem is that the game doesn't really have a moral center. Oh yeah, it says things like, oh, authoritarianism bad, but it doesn't really ever say that tracking people or doing the things that the authoritarians are doing is bad, because your protagonists do the same things. You still track people down, you still invade their privacy, which doesn't exist in this world. And if you want to, you can just play the game like you're the Red Hood. For those of you who don't really know who the Red Hood is, Jason Todd, aka the second Robin in DC Comics, is the Red Hood who just basically goes around killing criminals. That's his whole character. And the thing is, you can recruit people like spies and hitmen, and when you do so, they give you just silenced pistols, and suddenly the game becomes way easier. Because the game tells you in the beginning, well, DedSec doesn't kill people, but there's no penalty for doing so. There's no penalty for shooting people or, just killing every enemy you come across. There's no real flaw or punishment for doing things that way. Ironically, and this is kind of an example of how generic everything is, I recruited somebody who was in the singular street gang that's taking place all of London. I recruited somebody in there, and at some point in the game, I went and infiltrated one of their places. And I went through and killed everybody in that place. You know what I didn't realize? That one of those people who was in that place was somebody I had recruited. And I didn't know that until I looked at the team panel overlay, and it said, oh, this person is dead, killed by so-and-so. And I went, who is so-and-so? And I had to spend a minute trying to figure out if that was me or if somebody else had done it. Turns out, yes, they were so generic looking, and the game paid so little attention to who I had recruited, that me killing them didn't even register with me until after I had already done it. I should also point out that one of the weird things about this game is that while it likes to talk about authoritarianism being bad, it also indulges in really bizarre conspiracy theory thinking that is kind of like bread and butter for budding authoritarianism movements. Like, the start of the game, the whole crux of the entire plot is that they blow up Parliament in a false flag operation to blame you so that they can seize power and take over the country. They being a corporation taking over a government entity, because apparently when somebody blows up Parliament, the solution is to hand over the entirety of Great Britain to a para-security force? They didn't really think very hard about this game, so me thinking hard about it probably isn't what they intended. But it's really annoying, because at the core of it, you're dealing with all of these things that are trying to be allegories to the real world and trying to talk about real world issues, but it's doing so with such it's removed from all of what's going on, and it's completely clueless about the fact that this is the case. Honestly, the more I try to talk about the problems of this game, the more I keep thinking about going back to why Cyberpunk doesn't work. Because this is kind of what would happen if you took, the Cyberpunk theories and ideas and themes, and you just kind of watered them down a whole bunch until they were very generic. And that's really what I think about when I think about this game and why it's so frustrating. Because it's so very generic. It spends all of its time working so hard to make things as generic as possible. The most constant character that we get in the entire game is a faceless AI with a generic British male voice. Now, say what you will about the first two games, I wasn't a huge fan of either, really, but the first game at least had an angry character, even though he kinda looks like he's about to commit a school shooting in all the promotional art. And the second game was all about, wacky San Francisco hijinks with tech nerds and geeks, basically, and that was fine. It had its own identity, and there really wasn't a problem with it. The third game strips everything out of the entire game. Everything interesting about it has been removed, and has been replaced, essentially, with nothing. It's been replaced with a strange, static genericness. Honestly, the more I keep talking about this, and the more I think about this, the more I want to just do a video about Cyberpunk, and why things from the 80s are kind of hamstringing us. Because the thing is, the view that's being asserted in a game like Watch Dogs 3, the kind of, Fox cyberpunk aesthetic, doesn't work, because nothing, the way it views the world with corporations being the dominant force on the planet, is such a outdated concept, is such a backwards way of thinking in a world where, like, communist China can demand companies, unperson various countries in order to do business there. It's a bit fitting, though. Like, it's a bit fitting that the game spends all of its time making you wear a mask, because the mask is basically the character. There's no, like, actual characters there. There's no real, like, identity to it. And all the promotional art, it shows this character, like this pig person wearing a pig mask, and it's not a character, it's just an image, but it seems to think that the image is the character. Honestly, I've played like 40 hours of this game trying to find something like interesting to say about it, and I really can't. It's just the most generic gray blob that's trying to wear like a freedom fighter or rebellion like jacket, basically. One of the weirdest things is that you go from borough to borough and you liberate them, supposedly, and then the game's like, yeah, now the people of London will rise up against their oppressors, and you see some fireworks, and that's it. And you're left thinking, like, do these people who made this game know what rebellions look like? Do they know what rising up looks like? Because boroughs don't rise up. A borough rising up would be put down by the might of the military. We've seen riots before. Okay, this world is not, like, unfamiliar with riots, and when you're talking about, like, an authoritarian police state, yeah, these things, you can't just rise up in one borough and be like, these people are now defiant and are no longer gonna listen to the government or the corporations. It's so very, very juvenile. It's so very stupid. It's like my first rebellion. It's like a kid's playset for, like, open third world RPGs. That's the best way I can think about it. Honestly, the more I think about it, the more I kind of want to just do a video on, like, authoritarianism, too. But that feels like an entirely other topic that doesn't belong here. This game's just not very good, and I guess playing it and seeing all of its ideas go nowhere and basically just fizzle, it just made me mad enough that I wanted to talk about it. Honestly, I probably shouldn't have. I mean, now that I think about it and I've recorded all this, I probably shouldn't have just talked about it for this long, but I felt like I had to say something just to get it off my mind, because the game, like, grates on you. It's one of the rare games that it's not so bad that you want to point and laugh at it and say, that's awful. It's not so good that you want to talk about it because it's good. It's the most offensive form of awful, in that it's boring. Like, there are a lot of bad games out there, like Superman 64 or like Friday the 13th on the Famicom, games that are really bad, and you can talk about why they're bad, and you can really make an argument for why these games are bad. But Watch Dogs 3 doesn't have that. Watch Dogs 3 is like this weird game where it's also like puzzle piece and also generic and juvenile, and it's like a sponge. That's the best way I can think about it. Like, if you think of the most boring thing on the planet, just sitting there and nobody pays attention to it, that's this game. Just a blob of gray, like, slop just lying there, unscented, completely unnoticed by everyone else. That's Watch Dogs 3 in a nutshell. And that might be a little harsh, but honestly, the way that it treats authoritarianism as being, like, this thing that you basically can just shrug off in a day and age when you're seeing people murdered in the streets by authoritarian governments because they give so little of a fuck. And it just grates on me, I guess. Anyway, that's it for this. I'm probably gonna, I'll probably do better next time. This is my first time dealing with the camera, so hopefully it went well. Yeah, next time I'll probably script something more. I'll either talk about why I don't like Cyberpunk more, because honestly, how much stuff I see with Cyberpunk and why I don't like it seems like a fun thing to talk about. Yeah, maybe. Anyway, see y'all later.